I never imagined that Christmas night would shatter me so completely. While the city of Chicago glittered with festive lights outside my window, inside my worn apartment, I felt utterly alone, betrayed by the one person I vowed to protect at all costs. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Dorothy, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I've lived through decades of struggle, sacrifice, and what I believed was unconditional love. But that December night, as the wind whipped off Lake Michigan and rattled the windows of my small South Side apartment, I discovered that sometimes the people we love the most can be the ones who hurt us the deepest. My days had become an exhausting loop that started before dawn. The alarm clock's harsh buzz would jolt me awake at 5:30, and I'd shuffle across the cold linoleum floor to make coffee with shaking hands. The arthritis in my fingers made even the simplest tasks painful, but I pushed through. I had to. Marcus needed me, or so I thought. The smell of pine from my sparse Christmas decorations barely masked the cold void that had settled in my chest over the past few months. I'd hung just a few ornaments this year, the ones Marcus made in elementary school. Their construction paper angels faded and torn at the edges. Each morning, I'd dust them carefully, remembering the little boy who'd burst through the door after school, eager to show me his latest creation. But that little boy was gone. In his place was a 45-year-old man who called only when he needed something, usually money. Christmas had always been our time to connect. Even during his teenage years, when he'd roll his eyes at my excitement over decorating the tree, he'd still help me string the lights. We'd listen to Nat King Cole's Christmas album while I made his favorite cinnamon rolls, the kitchen filled with warmth and the promise that family meant something. Not this year. He didn't even call. Not once. The messages I sent pleading for a visit were delivered, but never answered. I could see the little check marks on my phone confirming he'd read them. Each ignored text felt like a small death, a piece of hope crumbling away. I'd sit by the window overlooking the neighborhood where children played in the snow, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings, and wonder what I'd done wrong. I clutched a faded photo of us at Navy Pier when Marcus was 12. His young face was bright with hope as we stood in front of the Ferris wheel, cotton candy sticky on his fingers. That day, he'd told me I was the best mom in the world. The contrast to the man he'd become was so sharp it took my breath away. I'd hoped Christmas would bring change. Instead, it brought the realization that hope alone wasn't enough anymore. Let me tell you about the years that led to this moment, because understanding my story means understanding how love can become a weapon when we're not careful, how the very people we die for can slowly chip away at our souls until we're left wondering who we really are. Marcus wasn't always distant. There was a time when this same apartment buzzed with his energy, his dreams, his laughter. After his father walked out when Marcus was 7, just disappeared one Tuesday morning like he was going to work and never came back, I became everything to my son. Mother, father, provider, protector. I sacrificed everything for him. My youth slipped away in double shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. My hands grew rough from industrial cleaners, my back bent from scrubbing floors in corporate towers where executives made more in a day than I made in a year. But I never complained. Not once. Every ache in my body was worth it if it meant Marcus had clothes that fit, school supplies, maybe even a small toy at Christmas. "Mom, you don't need to work so hard," he said once when he was 15, finding me soaking my swollen feet after a 14-hour day. But I just shook my head, hiding the sharp pain that shot through my ribs where I'd pulled a muscle moving desks. "Everything I do is for you, baby," I whispered, meaning every word. The sacrifices started small and grew over the years. When Marcus graduated high school, I cashed in my small retirement fund to help him with community college. When he decided to quit after 2 semesters, I bit my tongue and supported his choice to find himself. When he moved in with that girlfriend who treated him poorly, I welcomed her to family dinners even though she never bothered to help clear the table. But it was the money requests that slowly began to poison our relationship. The first time, Marcus was 22 and facing eviction. He called me at 2 in the morning, voice thick with panic. "Mom, I'm gonna be on the streets. Please, I need $800. My first Social Security check had just arrived. Without hesitation, I took it to the bank the next morning and wired him the money. "I'm gonna pay you back soon," he promised, his voice lighter already. "Soon as I get this job at the warehouse." But the repayment never came, and neither did the warehouse job. The pattern repeated month after month, year after year. Emergency after emergency that somehow required my intervention. Car repairs, medical bills, rent money, job training programs that never materialized. Each time, Marcus's voice carried that same desperate edge, and each time my mother's heart overruled my growing suspicions. My savings account, never substantial to begin with, dwindled to nothing. I started skipping meals to stretch my grocery budget. I learned to repair my clothes instead of replacing them. The heat in my apartment stayed lower each winter because every dollar I could spare went to my son's emergencies. The conversations began to change too. Where Marcus once called just to chat, to ask about my day or share something funny that happened to him, now every phone call had a purpose, a need, a crisis only I could solve. "Why don't you get a real job?" I heard him mutter to someone in the background during one of our calls. The words weren't meant for me, but they hit like a physical blow. A real job? I'd worked my entire life, often multiple jobs at once, to provide for him. When I gathered the courage to ask about the money I'd loaned him over the years, a cold silence would fall over our conversations. "Mom, you know I'm good for it," he'd say, irritation creeping into his voice. "I just need more time." Time stretched into months, then years. The debt between us grew, but so did something else. A manipulation so subtle I almost didn't recognize it. "If you really loved me, you wouldn't keep track of every penny," Marcus said during one particularly difficult conversation. The word stung because part of me wondered if he was right. Was I being petty? Selfish? Wasn't love supposed to be unconditional? The manipulation came disguised as guilt, wrapped in the language of family obligation. "I'm your only child, Mom. Who else do I have to turn to?" Or, "Remember how you always said you'd do anything for me?" Slowly, I began to question myself. Maybe I was too demanding. Maybe I should be grateful that he called at all. Maybe asking for the money back made me a bad mother. But deep in my chest, a seed of doubt had taken root. It grew quietly, fed by ignored birthdays and forgotten holidays, by phone calls that never came unless money was needed, by the growing realization that I had become less of a mother and more of a bank account to my own son. The microaggressions started small. Birthday cards that arrived a week late with generic messages clearly written in haste. Phone calls cut short when I tried to share news about my doctor's appointments or the activities at the senior center. The feeling that I was always interrupting something more important. "Mom, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of something," became his standard response to my calls. The callback rarely came. Christmas 2 years ago, Marcus showed up 3 hours late to dinner. He spent most of the time on his phone, texting people I didn't know about plans I wasn't included in. When I asked about his life, his job prospects, his girlfriend, the answers grew shorter and more dismissive. "Things are tough, you know? The economy's bad. It's not like when you were young." I wanted to remind him that I'd survived the recession of the 80s while raising him alone, that I knew something about tough times. But I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. The neglect became more obvious as time passed. Last winter, when I caught the flu and was bedridden for a week, Marcus didn't call once. I'd mentioned feeling sick during our last conversation, but apparently that wasn't significant enough to warrant a follow-up. Mrs. Jenkins from downstairs had to bring me soup and medicine, checking on me like the family I thought I had. When Marcus finally called 2 weeks later, asking for money for car repairs, I mentioned that I'd been sick. "Oh, sorry, Mom. I've been really busy. You feeling better?" That was it. No concern about what kind of sick, whether I'd seen a doctor, whether I'd needed help. Just a perfunctory question before moving on to what he really wanted to discuss. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who should see you most clearly? It's a particular kind of pain, a slow erosion of worth that happens so gradually you don't notice until you're already drowning. But the worst was still to come, the night that changed everything. The night I realized that sometimes the people we'd die for are the ones slowly killing us. It was Christmas Eve, and I'd spent the day preparing Marcus's favorite meal, hoping against hope that he'd show up. The apartment smelled like pot roast and fresh bread. I'd even bought a small gift, a sweater I'd seen him admire in a store window months earlier. It cost more than I should have spent, but seeing his face light up would have been worth eating ramen for the rest of the month. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 8. At 9, I called. "Hey, Mom, sorry, I can't make it tonight. Something came up with Riley." Riley was his current girlfriend, a woman I'd met exactly once and who seemed to regard me as an inconvenience at best. "But Marcus, it's Christmas Eve. I made all your favorites. I was hoping we could—" "Look, I'm really sorry, okay? We'll do something soon. I promise." The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by enough food for a family celebration, completely alone. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. A decision that seems crazy now, but at the time felt like the only way to understand what was happening to my son, to us. I decided to install a hidden camera. I told myself it was for protection. Marcus had been acting so strangely, so secretive about his living situation and his problems. What if he was in danger? What if someone was threatening him? What if the reason he couldn't visit, couldn't pay me back, was because he was genuinely in trouble and too proud to tell me? The camera was small, barely larger than a button, something I'd ordered online after seeing an advertisement. The instructions were simple enough that even I could figure them out. I told Marcus I wanted to drop off some Christmas cookies the next day, and he reluctantly agreed to a quick visit. His apartment was as run down as he'd described, in a neighborhood where broken streetlights cast long shadows and police sirens were a nightly lullaby. But as I helped him organize some papers on his coffee table, slipping the tiny device among his belongings, I noticed something that made my heart skip. Bills. Lots of them. But they were all marked paid in red stamps. Rent, utilities, car insurance, all current, all up to date. For someone who called me crying about money every few weeks, Marcus seemed to be managing his expenses just fine. I left the cookies and drove home with a churning stomach, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd gotten a job he hadn't told me about. Maybe Riley was helping with expenses. Maybe I was wrong to be suspicious. The camera connected to an app on my phone. For 3 days, I forced myself not to look. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, organized drawers that were already organized, and tried to focus on the New Year's resolutions I never kept. But on December 28th, curiosity and worry finally overcame my restraint. What I saw destroyed me. The footage showed Marcus's apartment during what I assumed was a typical evening. But this wasn't the struggling, desperate man who called me for money. This was someone I barely recognized. There he was, in the cramped living room I'd visited just days earlier, laughing and popping open a bottle of champagne with friends. Not cheap champagne either, the kind with gold foil and fancy labels that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The coffee table that had been covered in bills was now laden with expensive takeout containers, bottles of liquor I'd only seen in advertisements. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I heard Marcus say to his friends as they toasted some celebration I couldn't understand. "My mom still thinks I'm broke," he laughed, taking a long sip from his crystal flute. "She keeps sending me money every month like clockwork. It's like having my own personal ATM." The room erupted in cruel laughter. Someone I didn't recognize raised their glass and said, "To Marcus's mom, the best investment strategy ever." More laughter. My son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, was laughing along. But then came the words that shattered me completely. "The best part is, she won the lottery 6 months ago. Won big. Like life-changing big. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. But she's too guilty about spending it to tell me, so she keeps living like she's poor while I live like a king off her guilt money." My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped my phone. Marcus had won the lottery? When? How? How much? And why hadn't he told me? I rewound the footage, certain I'd misheard. But there it was again. Clear as day. My son describing his lottery winnings to his friends like it was all a big joke. Like the money I'd scraped together from my meager Social Security checks was some kind of game to him. The champagne, the expensive food, the casual way he talked about manipulating me. It all made sense now. Marcus didn't need my money. He'd been taking it anyway, letting me go without so he could live in luxury while pretending to be broke. Silent tears blurred my vision as the full weight of his betrayal hit me. I dropped my mother's old porcelain cup, the one she'd given me when I got married, the one that had survived my divorce, Marcus's childhood, decades of careful use. It shattered across the cold linoleum floor, blue and white fragments scattered like my heart. I looked up at the cracked mirror above the fireplace, and the woman staring back at me seemed smaller than before. Older, more tired. When had I become this person? This woman who could be so easily fooled by her own child? For hours I sat among the broken pieces of my mother's cup, watching the footage over and over. Each viewing revealed new details that made the betrayal deeper. The way Marcus checked his expensive watch when talking about me, the designer clothes he wore while claiming he couldn't afford rent, the casual cruelty in his voice when he described my guilt money. I thought about all the meals I'd skipped to send him cash, the heat I'd kept low to save money for his emergencies, the medications I'd stretched by taking half doses so I could afford his requests for help. Could I say no anymore? Did I have any right to demand respect? Or was I doomed to be the fool who loved too much, lost too much? That night, for the first time in decades, I didn't call Marcus for our usual evening check-in. I didn't send him a goodnight text. I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the broken pieces of more than just a teacup, and wondered who I really was beyond being someone's mother. Someone's ATM, apparently. The confrontation came 2 days later, though I hadn't planned it. Marcus called around lunchtime, his voice carrying that familiar edge of manufactured desperation. "Mom, I hate to ask, but I'm in real trouble. The landlord's threatening eviction, and I need $1,500 or I'll be on the street by Friday." For a moment, I said nothing. I could hear traffic in the background, the sound of a city that kept moving while my world had stopped spinning. Mom? Are you there? I'm here, I said quietly. Look, I know it's a lot, but I'm desperate. I've got nowhere else to turn. You know I wouldn't ask if… Marcus? I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to ask you something. A pause. Okay. Sure. Have you been honest with me about your finances? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had changed slightly, became more careful. What do you mean? I mean, are you really struggling the way you've told me you are? Mom, where is this coming from? Of course I'm struggling. You think I'd lie to you about something like that? The easy way the lie rolled off his tongue made my stomach turn. This was my son, the boy I'd raised to value honesty above all else. The child who used to confess to breaking things before I even noticed they were broken. I installed a camera in your apartment, I said. The words hung between us like a blade. I could hear Marcus's breathing change. Could almost feel his panic through the phone. You did what? I saw the footage, Marcus. I saw the champagne. I heard what you said about me being your personal ATM. I know about the lottery. The silence that followed was different from his usual pauses. This wasn't Marcus thinking about how to manipulate the situation. This was Marcus realizing he'd been caught. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. You had no right to spy on me. Not an apology, not an explanation, just anger that I'd discovered his lies. You're right, I said. I had no right. Just like you have no right to lie to me while I go without so you can live in luxury. It's not that simple. It is that simple. The force of my own voice surprised me. I'd raised my voice to Marcus maybe 3 times in his entire life. I've been eating 1 meal a day so I could send you money. I've been taking half my medications to stretch them. I've been living like a pauper while you drink champagne and laugh about it with your friends. Mom, you don't understand. Then explain it to me. Explain how lying to your mother for months is complicated. Explain how winning hundreds of thousands of dollars while letting me believe you're about to be homeless is anything other than cruel. Another long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his tone had shifted from panic to something that sounded almost like resentment. You don't understand how hard it is. The money won't last forever. I needed to be smart about it. Smart about it? Smart would have been telling me the truth. Smart would have been letting me keep my money instead of pretending you needed it. I never asked you to sacrifice for me. The words hit like a physical blow. Everything I'd done for 45 years, every choice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, dismissed with 9 words. You're right, I said finally. You never asked. I chose to. But you chose to take advantage of that choice. You chose to lie. You chose to let me go without while you celebrated with friends. I could hear voices in the background on Marcus's end. His friends, probably. The same ones who'd toasted to my gullibility. Mom, look, maybe we can work this out. Maybe I can explain things better in person. But it was too late for explanations. The trust between us hadn't just cracked. It had shattered as completely as my mother's teacup. No, I said quietly. I don't think you can. And I hung up. The phone rang immediately. Then again. Then a third time. Third. I turned it off and sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, listening to the city sounds outside, the rumble of the L train, the distant sound of traffic, the world continuing to spin while mine felt like it had stopped. The next few days brought a parade of family interventions that felt more like attacks. My daughter Sandra called first, her voice tight with disapproval. Mom, Marcus told me what you did. Installing a camera? That's crazy behavior. What's wrong with you? Sandra had always sided with her brother, even when we were both children, and Marcus would blame her for things he'd broken. She was 2 years older but had inherited her father's tendency to avoid conflict by picking the side most likely to create peace. Did Marcus also tell you about the lottery money? I asked. That's not the point. The point is that you violated his privacy. You spied on him like he was some kind of criminal. He lied to me for months, Sandra. He took money he didn't need while I… That's between you and him, she interrupted. But what you did was wrong, invasive. I'm ashamed of you. Ashamed. Of me. For discovering I was being robbed by my own son. My husband Frank, who I'd married 5 years earlier in a quiet ceremony at City Hall, offered his usual brand of detached wisdom over dinner. Dorothy, you need to just let this go. Marcus is a grown man. If he wants to lie, that's his choice. If you want to give him money, that's yours. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Frank had never had children. He'd told me early in our courtship that he'd never wanted the responsibility. I'd thought that might make him more objective about family drama, but instead, it just made him indifferent. Complicated? I set down my fork. Frank, he stole from me. He didn't steal anything. You gave him money freely, under false pretenses. Frank shrugged. That's what families do. They help each other. Sometimes people aren't completely honest about why they need help. It's not the end of the world, but it felt like the end of my world. The casual way everyone dismissed Marcus's lies, the way they made me feel like the villain for discovering them, it was almost worse than the original betrayal. The worst intervention came from Marcus himself, 3 days after our phone confrontation. He showed up at my apartment without calling first, looking contrite and carrying a bouquet of flowers from the grocery store. Mom, can we talk? I let him in because he was still my son, despite everything. He sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd rocked him as a baby, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd listened to him practice speeches for school. I'm sorry, he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. I should have told you about the lottery. It's complicated. Complicated how? Taxes, investments, legal stuff. I was trying to protect the money, make sure I handled it right. I didn't want to tell you until I had it all figured out. The lie was smooth, well-rehearsed. Marcus had probably been practicing it since our phone call, but I'd heard him laughing about manipulating me. I'd seen him celebrating while I worried about his rent. And the money I've been sending you? I thought maybe I should put that away too. Save it for both of us, you know? Like a family investment. A family investment. I repeated the word slowly. Is that what you told your friends when they toasted to me being your personal ATM? Marcus's face went red. They were joking around. I was drunk. People say stupid things when they're drunk. Were you drunk when you cashed my checks too? Mom, please. I made mistakes, okay? But I love you. You know that. We can fix this. But looking at him sitting there, handsome and well-dressed and desperate only to maintain his access to my money, I realized something that felt like both a revelation and a death. I didn't know if Marcus loved me. I knew he needed me. I knew he was used to me being there, providing for him, solving his problems. But love? Real love didn't lie. Real love didn't laugh about manipulation. Real love didn't let someone go without while hoarding resources in secret. I need you to leave, I said quietly. Mom, please go. He left the flowers on my coffee table. Grocery store daisies that would be dead in 3 days. Like the illusion of the relationship I thought we had. But it wasn't the confrontations with family that finally broke me. It wasn't even Marcus's continued lies. It was the realization that I had lost myself completely in trying to be the perfect mother. When had I stopped having opinions that weren't about Marcus? When had I stopped doing things just for me? When had I become a person whose entire identity was wrapped up in being needed by someone who didn't respect me? I spent that night looking through photo albums, tracing the progression from a young woman with dreams to someone who existed only as a supporting character in her son's life. There I was at 25, starting my own business cleaning service. There I was at 30, learning to fix my car myself because I couldn't afford a mechanic. Somewhere along the way, that self-sufficient woman had disappeared. It wasn't until my neighbor Mrs. Jenkins knocked on my door the next morning that I realized I wasn't completely alone. Dorothy, honey, you look terrible. What's going on? Mrs. Jenkins was 81, a widow who'd moved to Chicago from Alabama 30 years earlier. She had a way of seeing through pretense that both terrified and comforted me. I found myself telling her everything. About Marcus, about the camera, about the lottery, about feeling like I'd wasted my life on someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. Mrs. Jenkins listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, refilling my coffee cup when it got empty. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. How much money did you give him over the years? She asked. I'd never added it up, but sitting there in my kitchen, I started calculating. Emergency payments, rent help, car repairs, medical bills, job training programs, Christmas gifts, birthday money, groceries when he claimed to be broke. Maybe $40,000, I said finally. Maybe more. Mrs. Jenkins whistled low. That's a lot of Social Security checks. I thought I was helping him get on his feet. Honey, you can't help someone who doesn't want to walk. She told me about her own son, David, who'd developed a gambling addiction in his 30s. For years, she'd bailed him out, covered his debts, believed his promises to change. She'd lost her house helping him. She'd gone into debt. She'd made herself sick with worry. What changed? I asked. I realized that every time I saved him from the consequences of his choices, I was taking away his chance to learn from them. I was keeping him weak by being strong for him. But what if he'd ended up on the streets? Then maybe he would have learned what the streets felt like and decided he didn't want to live there. Mrs. Jenkins reached across the table and took my hand. Some people won't grow up until you stop treating them like children, even when those children are 45 years old. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to say no. Not just to Marcus, but to the version of myself that had enabled his lies for so many years. The first test came 2 days later. Marcus called with another emergency. This time, a car repair that would cost $800. Mom, I know things have been weird between us, but I really need your help. My car won't start and I can't get to work if I can't drive. In the past, I would have already been reaching for my checkbook. The thought of Marcus stranded, unable to work, would have sent me into an anxiety spiral that only ended when I'd solved his problem. Instead, I took a deep breath and said something I'd never said before. No. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew. No? No, Marcus. I'm not giving you any more money. But Mom, this is different. This isn't about the lottery thing. This is about my car. I need my car to work. Then I suggest you use some of your lottery winnings to fix it. The silence stretched between us. I could hear Marcus breathing, could almost feel him recalibrating, trying to find the right words to change my mind. Look, Mom, I know you're mad about the lottery, but I can explain. I'm not mad, Marcus. I'm done. Done with what? Done pretending that giving you money is helping you. Done pretending that your emergencies are more important than my well-being. Done being your personal ATM. I used his words deliberately, and he knew it. The sharp intake of breath on his end told me he remembered what I'd heard him say to his friends. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Yes, you are. And because I love you, I'm not going to enable you anymore. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking. But for the first time in months, the tremor wasn't from anxiety. It was from adrenaline. From the rush of finally standing up for myself. That night, I slept better than I had in years. No anxiety about Marcus's problems. No worry about what emergency would come next. No guilt about whether I was doing enough for him. Just quiet, peaceful sleep in my own bed, in my own home that I'd paid for with my own work. Have you ever noticed how liberating it feels to stop carrying someone else's problems? It's like setting down a heavy suitcase you didn't realize was breaking your back until you finally put it down. The next few days brought a barrage of calls, texts, and visits that felt like the death throes of our old relationship. Marcus tried every approach he'd ever used to get money from me, cycling through them like a salesman working through his pitch book. First came desperation. Mom, please, I'm literally going to lose everything. Then anger. You're being selfish. What happened to family taking care of family? Then manipulation. Fine, don't help me. But when I end up homeless, remember that you could have prevented it. Then guilt. I guess I was wrong about having a mother who loved me. Each attempt felt weaker than the last. Without my participation, Marcus's drama couldn't sustain itself. He needed me to panic, to worry, to rush in with solutions. When I refused to play my part, the whole performance fell flat. But the real change wasn't in Marcus. It was in me. For the first time in decades, I started thinking about what I wanted instead of what Marcus needed. I organized my apartment not because I might have visitors, but because I liked living in a clean, beautiful space. I bought groceries based on what I wanted to eat, not what I could afford after sending Marcus his monthly allowance. I started walking around the neighborhood in the mornings, something I'd always meant to do but never had time for because I was too busy worrying about my son's problems. Chicago in early spring was beautiful in a way I'd forgotten to notice. The trees along Lakeshore Drive were budding, the lake reflected the sky like polished metal, and the city hummed with the energy of people building their lives. It was during one of these walks that I made another decision that surprised me. I was going to get legal advice. Mrs. Jenkins had mentioned a community center that offered free legal consultations for seniors. I'd never thought of myself as someone who needed a lawyer, but $40,000 wasn't nothing. If Marcus had truly defrauded me, shouldn't there be some recourse? The lawyer, a young woman named Amy Chen who volunteered her time at the center, listened to my story with growing amazement. Mrs. Richardson, what your son did might constitute elder financial abuse, she said. Taking money under false pretenses, especially from an elderly parent, is a crime in Illinois. The word crime hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought of Marcus as dishonest, manipulative, maybe selfish, but criminal? I don't want to press charges, I said quickly. I just want to protect myself. Amy nodded. I understand, but you should know your options. We can also help you set up financial protections, so this doesn't happen again. She helped me open a new bank account that Marcus didn't know about, one where I could keep the majority of my Social Security and pension payments safe. She showed me how to set up automatic bill payments, so my essential expenses were covered first, before I could be tempted to give money away. The most important thing, Amy said, is learning to see financial manipulation for what it is. Family members often use our love against us. They make us feel guilty for having boundaries. That word, boundaries, stuck with me. I'd never thought I was allowed to have boundaries with my children. Wasn't unconditional love supposed to be exactly that? Unconditional? Even unconditional love can have conditions on behavior, Amy explained. You can love your son without funding his lies. I also started therapy, something I'd never considered before but desperately needed. Dr. Sarah Martinez worked with seniors dealing with family conflicts, and her office became a sanctuary where I could say things I'd never admitted even to myself. I think I've been afraid of not being needed, I told her during our third session. If I'm not solving Marcus's problems, what's my purpose? What was your purpose before you had children? She asked. The question stumped me. I'd had Marcus so young, had been so focused on being a good mother, that I'd never really developed an identity outside of that role. I don't remember, I admitted. That's okay. It's never too late to figure out who you are beyond being someone's mother. Our sessions helped me understand that my relationship with Marcus hadn't been healthy for years, maybe decades. I'd enabled his dependency instead of encouraging his growth. I'd protected him from consequences instead of letting him learn from his mistakes. I'd made his problems my problems until I lost track of where he ended and I began. But understanding the problem and living with the solution were two different things. Breaking the patterns of a lifetime isn't easy, especially when everyone around you thinks you're being unreasonable. Sandra called me regularly during this period, always with the same message. I was being too hard on Marcus. I was holding a grudge. I should forgive and forget because that's what mothers do. He's learned his lesson, Mom, she said during one particularly frustrating conversation. He's sorry. He wants to make things right. How is he planning to make things right? I asked. He wants to pay you back. How much? A pause. Well, he can't pay it all back at once, but he wants to set up a payment plan. With what money? The lottery winnings he swore he needed to protect? Or is he going to get a job? Mom, you're being mean. Mean. For expecting my son to take responsibility for lying to me for months. For expecting some acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. Sandra, let me ask you something. If someone who wasn't related to you had taken $40,000 from you under false pretenses, what would you call that? That's different. Marcus is family. Why does being family give him the right to steal from me? He didn't steal. What would you call taking money you don't need from someone you've lied to about your circumstances? What would you call letting your mother go without medication so you can buy champagne? Sandra couldn't answer that question, so she hung up instead. Frank's response was even more frustrating. You're making this too complicated, he said for the 100th time. Just accept that Marcus is flawed and move on. I have moved on, I said. I've moved on from giving him money. You're being stubborn. I'm being smart. But Frank didn't see it that way. He saw my newfound boundaries as an inconvenience that was disrupting the family peace. He preferred the version of me that absorbed everyone else's problems without complaint. The pressure to return to my old patterns was enormous. Everyone wanted me to go back to being the Dorothy who said yes to everything, who prioritized everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. But I'd gotten a taste of what life felt like when I wasn't constantly worried about Marcus's manufactured crises, and I wasn't willing to give that up. Spring arrived in Chicago with its usual dramatic flair. The gray winter gave way to explosions of color in Grant Park, and the lake took on the impossible blue that made tourists stop and stare. I celebrated by doing something I'd wanted to do for 20 years but never had time for. I enrolled in an art class at the Garfield Community Center. The first day, I walked into a room full of easels and smelled the familiar scent of acrylic paint and possibility. I chose a seat by the window where I could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon. Have you painted before? Asked the instructor, a woman about my age with silver hair and paint-stained fingers. A little. When I was young, I said. Before I had children. Before I had children. Everything in my life was divided into that simple before and after. That first painting was terrible. The proportions were all wrong, the colors muddy, the brushstrokes hesitant. But it was mine. I'd created something that hadn't existed before, something that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or problems. I went home covered in paint, happier than I'd been in months. The art class became the highlight of my week. Every Thursday, I'd pack my supplies and take the bus to the community center, where I learned to see the world differently. Instead of just noticing problems to be solved, I started noticing the way light hit buildings, the colors of shadows, the patterns people made as they moved through their lives. My instructor, Helen, had raised 4 kids as a single mother before discovering painting in her 60s. Art saved my life, she told me. It reminded me that I was a whole person, not just a collection of other people's needs. Helen became a friend in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Our friendship wasn't based on what I could do for her or what she could do for me. We just enjoyed each other's company. We'd go for coffee after class and talk about colors and light and the way the city looked different depending on your mood. "You're blooming," she told me one day as I worked on a painting of the lake at sunrise. "It's like watching a flower open." I looked at the canvas in front of me, still not perfect, but bold and bright and unapologetically cheerful, and realized she was right. For the first time in decades, I was growing instead of just surviving. But growth isn't linear, and it isn't always comfortable. Just when I thought I'd figured out my new life, Marcus forced another confrontation that tested everything I'd learned. It happened on a Thursday evening in late April. I'd just come home from art class, my fingers still smudged with paint, feeling peaceful and accomplished. The painting I'd worked on that day, a street scene from my neighborhood, was the best thing I'd ever created. I was washing paintbrushes in my kitchen sink when I heard voices in the hallway outside my apartment. Familiar voices. Marcus and Sandra, talking in low, urgent tones. They knocked, and I debated not answering. I knew why they were there. I'd been expecting this visit for weeks. "Mom, we know you're home," Sandra called through the door. "We saw your light on." I opened the door to find them both looking serious and determined. Marcus had lost weight, I noticed. He looked tired in a way that expensive clothes couldn't hide. "We need to talk," Sandra said without preamble. I let them in because avoiding the conversation would only delay it. They sat on my couch with the careful positioning of an intervention team. "Mom," Marcus began, and I could hear the rehearsed nature of his speech. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, about the mistakes I made. Okay, I want to make things right. I want to pay you back every penny I owe you. How?" "I've been working with a financial advisor, setting up a payment plan. I can give you $1,000 a month until the debt is paid off." $1,000 a month was more than I'd ever given him in a single payment. It was also exactly the amount that would make me feel like I had to start worrying about his finances again. "Where is this money coming from?" I asked. Marcus and Sandra exchanged a look. "From my lottery winnings," he said. "I've been investing it, making it grow. The advisor says I can afford to pay you back without hurting my long-term financial security." "I see. And what about the lying? What about the months of taking money you didn't need while letting me think you were desperate?" "I told you that was a mistake. I was trying to protect the money until I could figure out how to handle it properly." The lie was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. Almost fell back into the old pattern of accepting his explanations, because it was easier than confronting the truth. But I'd learned too much about myself to be fooled again. "Marcus, I heard you laughing about manipulating me. I heard you call me your personal ATM. That wasn't about protecting money. That was about stealing from me while mocking me to your friends." His face flushed. "I was drunk. People say stupid things when they're drunk. Were you drunk every time you cashed one of my checks? Were you drunk every time you called me crying about eviction while sitting in an apartment with paid bills?" Sandra jumped in before Marcus could answer. "Mom, he's trying to make amends. Why can't you just accept his apology and move forward?" "Because the apology isn't real. He's not sorry he lied to me. He's sorry he got caught. There's a difference." "You're being paranoid," Sandra said. "You're looking for problems where they don't exist." "Am I? Marcus, tell me truthfully, if I hadn't installed that camera, would you have ever told me about the lottery winnings?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Sandra for support. Eventually, yes. When I had everything figured out." "When? Give me a timeline." "I don't know. Maybe by the end of the year." "So you would have let me give you money I couldn't afford for another 8 months while you had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank?" "It wasn't that simple." "It is that simple." I stood up, surprising myself with the force of my anger. "You stole from me. You laughed about it. You let me go without food and medication so you could live in luxury. And now you want to pay me back with my own money and pretend that makes everything okay?" "It's not your money," Marcus shot back, his careful facade finally cracking. "I won that lottery. It's mine. You're absolutely right. It is yours. Just like my social security checks are mine. Just like my pension is mine. Just like my decision about who I give money to is mine." Sandra tried to mediate. "This is getting too heated. Let's all calm down and—" "No," I said, looking directly at Marcus. "I'm done being calm. I'm done being understanding. I'm done pretending that being family gives you the right to treat me like an ATM." Marcus's mask slipped completely then. The contrite son disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "Fine. You want to hold a grudge? Hold a grudge. But don't come crying to me when you need help." The threat was clear. Accept his terms or lose him entirely. A year ago, that threat would have broken me. The fear of losing my son would have sent me scrambling to apologize, to accept any conditions he set. to preserve our relationship at any cost. But I wasn't the same woman who'd installed that camera on Christmas Eve. Goodbye, Marcus, I said quietly. He and Sandra left in a cloud of accusations and threats. I heard them arguing in the hallway as they waited for the elevator, Sandra trying to convince Marcus to come back and try a different approach. I closed the door behind them and sat in my quiet apartment, waiting for the familiar anxiety to hit. The panic about losing my son, about being alone, about making the wrong choice. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the exhausting cycle of Marcus's manufactured crises, free from the guilt and manipulation that had defined our relationship, free to be myself instead of just someone's mother. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the lights of Chicago twinkle in the distance. The city looked different somehow, brighter, more full of possibility. But the story wasn't over yet. One more test was coming, one that would prove whether my transformation was real or just temporary. The test came 3 weeks later, in the form of a phone call that almost broke my resolve. I was getting ready for art class, packing my brushes and paints, when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something made me answer. Mrs. Richardson, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from Rush University Medical Center. I'm calling about your son, Marcus Richardson. My blood turned to ice. Hospital calls were every mother's nightmare. Is he okay? What happened? Mr. Richardson was brought to the emergency room this morning after a car accident. He's stable, but he has some significant injuries. He's been asking for you. The old Dorothy would have dropped everything and rushed to the hospital without question. The old Dorothy would have forgotten every lie, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty in the face of her child's need. But I wasn't the old Dorothy anymore. How serious are his injuries? I asked. He has a broken leg, some bruised ribs, and a concussion. He'll need surgery on the leg, but his condition isn't life-threatening. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by suspicion. Marcus had been driving around for months without trouble. Now, suddenly, just weeks after our confrontation, he was in a car accident serious enough to require my presence? Doctor, can you tell me how the accident happened? He hit a tree on Lakeshore Drive. He told the paramedics his brakes failed. His brakes failed. The same brakes that had required $800 in repairs just a few months earlier. The repair I'd refused to pay for. The repair he claimed he couldn't afford, despite having lottery winnings in the bank. Doctor, I'll be there as soon as I can, I said. But first I need to ask a favor. Can someone take a photo of his car, of the brake system? I'd like to see the extent of the mechanical failure. There was a pause. Mrs. Richardson, that's usually something that would be handled by insurance companies or police. I understand. But I'd appreciate it if someone could document the car's condition. For family records. It was a strange request, and I could hear the confusion in Dr. Williams's voice. But she agreed to see what she could do. I hung up and sat heavily in my kitchen chair. Every instinct I had as a mother was screaming at me to rush to Marcus's side, to forget our conflicts and focus on his immediate need, to fall back into the familiar pattern of crisis and rescue. But I'd learned to question my instincts when it came to Marcus. I called Mrs. Jenkins. I need your advice, I said, and told her about the hospital call. Lord have mercy, she said. That boy doesn't know when to quit, does he? You think he's lying about the accident? Honey, I think that boy would lie about the weather if it got him what he wanted. But the question isn't whether he's lying. The question is whether you're going to let his crisis become your crisis again. She was right. Even if the accident was real, even if Marcus was genuinely hurt, that didn't erase the months of lies and manipulation. It didn't mean I had to drop my boundaries and resume my role as his personal problem solver. I drove to the hospital, but I didn't rush. I took my time, thought about what I wanted to say, prepared myself for whatever manipulation might be waiting for me. Marcus was in a private room, his leg elevated and wrapped in bandages. He looked genuinely injured, but also genuinely surprised to see me. Mom, you came. Of course I came. You're hurt. I wasn't sure you would. After last time, he let the sentence hang, a subtle guilt trip about our confrontation. How are you feeling? I asked, sitting in the chair beside his bed but keeping my purse on my lap, my coat on. Body language that said I wasn't staying long. Pretty banged up. The doctor says I'll need surgery tomorrow, and then physical therapy for months. I'm going to be out of work for a while. There it was. The setup. The crisis that would require my intervention. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Marcus waited for more. For offers of help. For questions about what he needed. For me to start problem solving. When none of that came, he shifted tactics. The weird thing is, the brakes just went out. Completely failed. I guess I should have gotten them fixed when I had the chance. He was referring to the repair I'd refused to pay for, the one that had started our current conflict. The implication was clear. If I'd given him the money, this accident wouldn't have happened. Did you ever get your brakes checked after that? I asked. I couldn't afford it. You know that. With your lottery winnings? Marcus's face tightened. Mom, I told you. That money is tied up in investments. I can't just access it whenever I want. The lie was so casual, so automatic, that I almost admired the skill involved. Marcus could construct false narratives faster than most people could tell the truth. So what happens now? I asked. Well, I'm going to need help. The surgery, the recovery time. I won't be able to work for months. I'll need someone to help with bills, groceries, getting around. He was painting a picture of complete dependency, positioning himself as helpless and me as his only possible savior. That sounds challenging, I said. Another pause. Marcus was clearly expecting more engagement, more offers of assistance. Mom, I know things have been tense between us, but I really need you right now. I need your help. What kind of help? Financial help. Just until I can get back on my feet. The insurance will cover the medical bills, but I'll still have rent, utilities, groceries. What about your lottery winnings? I told you, they're invested. I can't touch them without huge penalties. I stood up and walked to the window. Rush University Medical Center had a view of the Chicago skyline, the city stretching out in all directions under a cloudy spring sky. Somewhere out there, people were making real decisions, solving real problems, living authentic lives. Marcus, I said without turning around, I want to tell you a story. Mom, I'm really tired. Can we talk about this later? This won't take long. I faced him again. Once there was a woman who loved her son so much that she would do anything for him, give him anything, sacrifice anything. She thought that was what good mothers do. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed. The woman worked hard her whole life, often multiple jobs, to make sure her son had everything he needed. When he became an adult, she continued supporting him because she thought that's what love looked like. Mom, let me finish. The woman gave and gave until she had very little left for herself. She went without food, without medication, without heat in the winter, all so her son wouldn't have to struggle. I sat back down, looking directly at Marcus. And then one day, the woman discovered that her son didn't need her help, that he'd been taking her money while having plenty of his own, that he'd been laughing about her stupidity with his friends, that he saw her not as a mother to be cherished, but as a resource to be exploited. Marcus's face had gone pale. That's not fair. That's not how it was. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly how it was. And now, here you are again, with another crisis that somehow requires my money to solve. This is different. This is real. I'm hurt. Yes, you are hurt. And I'm sorry about that. But being hurt doesn't give you the right to lie to me again. I'm not lying. Marcus, stop. My voice was firm but not angry. Just stop. I know about the brake repair. I know you could have afforded it with your lottery winnings. I know this accident might have been prevented if you'd chosen to spend your money on car maintenance instead of champagne and expensive dinners. Silence filled the hospital room. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the city, the distant wail of sirens, the rumble of traffic, life continuing its complicated dance. So what are you saying? Marcus asked finally. I'm saying that I love you, but I won't be your personal ATM anymore. I'm saying that you have resources to handle this crisis yourself. I'm saying that maybe it's time you learn to solve your own problems. You're abandoning me when I need you most. No, I'm refusing to enable you when you need to grow most. I stood up again, gathered my purse and coat. I hope your surgery goes well. I hope you recover quickly. But I won't be paying for your recovery. Mom, please, I'm scared. For a moment, hearing that vulnerability in his voice, I almost wavered. Almost sat back down and asked what he needed. Almost fell back into the familiar pattern of rescue and enabling. But then I remembered his laughter on that hidden camera footage, his casual description of me as his personal ATM, the months of lies while I went without medication to send him money he didn't need. Being scared is part of being an adult, I said gently. Figure it out. I walked out of that hospital room and didn't look back. In the elevator, surrounded by other visitors clutching flowers and get-well cards, I waited for the guilt to hit. For the voice in my head that would tell me I was a terrible mother, a heartless person, someone who abandoned her child in his time of need. But the voice didn't come. Instead, I felt something that surprised me, pride. I had just faced the ultimate test of my new boundaries. My child, injured and vulnerable, asking for help. The situation that would have broken my resolve a year ago. And I had held firm, not because I didn't love Marcus, because I did love him. Love him enough to stop enabling his lies and manipulation. love him enough to force him to grow up and take responsibility for his choices. The real transformation wasn't in saying no to his requests for money. It was in understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through Lincoln Park, watching families play in the sunshine, children laughing on swings, parents pushing strollers, teenagers playing basketball. The ordinary moments of connection that make life meaningful. For the first time in years, I could imagine filling my days with something other than worry about Marcus's problems. I could imagine friendships that weren't based on need or obligation. I could imagine mornings when my first thought wasn't about someone else's crisis. At home, I made myself dinner. A proper dinner with vegetables and protein and a small glass of wine. I ate slowly, tasting every bite, grateful for the abundance in my life that I'd been too stressed to notice before. After dinner, I worked on a painting I'd started the week before, a street scene from my neighborhood, full of the kind of ordinary beauty that I'd learned to see again. The light falling across an old building, children playing in a small park, people walking their dogs, living their quiet, unexamined lives. As I painted, I thought about the difference between love and enabling, about the way we sometimes damage the people we care about most by refusing to let them experience the consequences of their choices, about how growth requires discomfort, and comfort can prevent growth. Marcus would figure out how to pay for his recovery. Maybe he'd finally access some of those lottery winnings he claimed were tied up in investments. Maybe he'd discover that medical insurance covered more than he'd realized. Maybe he'd learn to ask for help in honest ways instead of through manipulation and lies. Or maybe he wouldn't learn any of those things. Maybe he'd continue looking for people to exploit, relationships to manipulate, situations to turn to his advantage. That was his choice to make, his lesson to learn or refuse to learn. My job wasn't to manage his choices anymore. My job was to live my own life with integrity and intention. I painted until nearly midnight, losing myself in the colors and textures, the meditative rhythm of brush on canvas. When I finally stepped back to look at what I'd created, I was surprised by what I saw. The street scene was full of light. Not the harsh, bright light of midday, but the warm, golden light of late afternoon. The kind of light that makes everything look more beautiful, more hopeful, more alive. It was the light of someone who had learned to see the world clearly again. Someone who had stopped living in the shadows of other people's problems and stepped into the sunshine of her own life. Over the next few months, I built a new routine that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or crises. I went to art class every Thursday and began showing my paintings at a small gallery that featured local artists. I joined a book club at the library that met Tuesday evenings. I volunteered at a literacy program that helped adults learn to read. I made friends, real friends, not people who needed things from me or whom I needed to fix. Helen from art class became a regular companion for coffee and museum visits. Mrs. Jenkins and I started taking walks together in the evenings, sharing stories and observations about our changing neighborhood. I bought new clothes for the first time in years, colors that made me feel vibrant instead of invisible. I got my hair cut and styled in a way that felt contemporary instead of resigned. I looked in mirrors and saw a woman who was growing instead of just surviving. Marcus called occasionally, always with some new crisis that required my intervention. Car troubles, job problems, relationship drama, health scares real or imagined. Each crisis was presented as urgent, unique, requiring immediate action. Each time I listened politely and then said some version of, "That sounds challenging. What are you going to do about it?" The calls became less frequent as Marcus realized I wasn't going to resume my role as his personal problem solver. He found other people to meet his needs, or he learned to meet them himself. Either way, his problems stopped being my problems. Sandra continued to pressure me to reconcile with Marcus, to return to our old patterns for the sake of family harmony. But family harmony built on one person's exploitation isn't really harmony at all. It's just a pretty name for dysfunction. Frank remained largely indifferent to the changes in my life, which was actually a relief. His lack of investment in my relationship with Marcus made him less likely to pressure me to change course. The art became my salvation and my joy. Every canvas was a conversation with myself about color and light, and the way the world looked when you paid attention to it. I painted street scenes and lake views and portraits of the friends who had become my chosen family. "You're getting really good at this," Helen said one Thursday as we packed up our supplies. "Have you thought about taking some advanced classes?" I had thought about it. I'd thought about a lot of things that had nothing to do with other people's expectations or needs. Travel, education, maybe even dating, though that seemed both terrifying and fascinating. "I might," I said. "I have time now." Time. Such a simple word for such a precious commodity. For years, all of my time had belonged to other people. Marcus's crises, Sandra's demands for family peace, Frank's preference for a wife who didn't make waves. Now my time belonged to me. I could spend it learning new things, creating beautiful objects, building relationships based on mutual respect instead of need. Spring turned to summer, and Chicago bloomed around me like a great sprawling garden. I spent long hours in Lincoln Park, sketching the scenes that caught my eye. Families having picnics, teenagers playing volleyball, elderly couples holding hands on benches, watching the world rush past them. I was sketching near the lake one evening when a man about my age sat down on the bench beside me. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward my sketch pad. "Are you an artist?" I almost said no, almost minimized my work the way I'd been trained to minimize everything about myself. But then I looked at the sketch in my lap, a honest, careful rendering of the scene in front of us, and realized it was beautiful. "I am," I said. "I'm an artist." His name was Robert, and he was recently retired from teaching high school history. We talked for an hour about art and books and the way the city looked different depending on the season. When he asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime, I said yes without hesitation. It wasn't romance, exactly. It was something better. The possibility of companionship with someone who saw me as a whole person instead of just a source of support or solution to problems. Summer faded to autumn, and I celebrated my first anniversary of saying no to Marcus by treating myself to a weekend trip to Milwaukee to visit art museums. I stayed in a small hotel, ate meals in restaurants I chose, and spent hours looking at paintings by people who had learned to see the world clearly. On the train ride home, watching the Illinois countryside flash past my window, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, exhausted, anxious, defined entirely by other people's needs, living in a constant state of crisis management, never able to relax because the next emergency was always just a phone call away. That woman felt like someone I'd known long ago, in a different life. I could remember her clearly, could even feel compassion for her struggles, but I couldn't imagine being her again. The train pulled into Union Station as the sun was setting, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and orange. I gathered my things and walked through the station, past travelers heading to their own destinations, their own adventures, their own carefully chosen lives. Outside, the city hummed with its familiar energy, traffic and construction, street musicians and food vendors, the beautiful chaos of millions of people figuring out how to live together in one place. I took the bus home instead of calling a taxi, wanting to extend the journey to savor the return to my own space. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary, clean and bright and filled with my own choices, paintings on the walls that I'd created with my own hands, books I'd chosen because they interested me, furniture arranged the way I liked it. This was home, not the place where someone else's problems got solved, but the place where I got to be myself. The real test of my transformation came unexpectedly, on a cold December morning exactly 1 year after I'd installed that hidden camera in Marcus's apartment. I was making coffee and planning my day. Art class, then lunch with Helen, then an evening at the book club, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing in the hallway, looking nervous and holding a large envelope. My first instinct was not to answer. We hadn't spoken in months, and I'd built a life that didn't include his drama or demands. But curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Mom," he said when I opened the door. "Can I come in? I have something for you." He looked different, thinner maybe, more tired. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by ordinary jeans and a worn jacket. He seemed smaller somehow, less sure of himself. I let him in but didn't offer coffee or invite him to sit. We stood in my living room surrounded by the art and books and small luxuries that filled my new life. Marcus looked around, taking in the changes, the paintings on the walls, the fresh flowers on the coffee table, the general sense of abundance and care. "This place looks great," he said. "Really great. Thank you." He handed me the envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a cashier's check for $47,000, more than I'd calculated, but probably close to accurate when interest and inflation were factored in. "It's everything I owe you," Marcus said, "plus interest. I should have done this a long time ago." I looked at the check, then at my son. Where did this come from? My lottery winnings. I finally accessed them. I thought they were tied up in investments. Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed. They weren't. I was selfish and scared. I thought if I gave you the money back, you might not need me anymore. It was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard from him in years. "So what changed?" I asked. "I realized you already don't need me anymore. And that's okay. Maybe it's better." He sat down without being invited, looking suddenly older than his 46 years. "The accident," he continued. "It was real. But you were right about the brakes. I could have afforded to fix them. I was just being stupid and stubborn. And when I was lying in that hospital bed, waiting for you to rush in and save me like you always did, and you didn't, it was terrifying. But it was also the wake-up call I needed. I sat across from him, the check still in my hands. What kind of wake-up call? That I'd become the kind of person who takes advantage of his own mother. That I'd been lying for so long I'd started believing my own lies. That I was 45 years old and still acting like a child because someone was always there to clean up my messes. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to find the words to explain something difficult. I got a job, Mom, a real job. Nothing fancy, just warehouse work. But it's honest. I pay my own bills. I fixed my own car. I'm learning how to be an adult. How does it feel? I asked. Scary, but good. Like maybe I can trust myself now. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. Children walking to school, adults heading to work, the ordinary rhythms of people taking care of their own responsibilities. I don't expect you to forgive me, Marcus said finally. Not right away, maybe not ever. I know I hurt you. I know I took advantage of your love. Do you understand why I had to stop helping you? I think so. You weren't really helping me, were you? You were just enabling me to stay weak. It was such an accurate assessment that I almost smiled. What made you realize that? Therapy. And watching how much better your life got once you stopped solving my problems for me. Marcus looked around again at my transformed apartment, at the evidence of a life lived for itself instead of in service to someone else's dysfunction. You look happy, Mom. Happier than I've seen you in years. Maybe happier than I've ever seen you. He was right. I was happy. Not the desperate, anxious happiness that comes from temporarily solving someone else's crisis, but the deep, sustainable happiness that comes from living authentically. I am happy, I said. I'm glad. You deserve to be happy. Marcus stood up to leave, and I walked him to the door. Before he left, he turned back to me. I know I don't have the right to ask this, but maybe sometime we could have coffee. Just coffee, no agenda. I'd like to get to know the person you've become. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Honesty, humility, the possibility of a real relationship based on mutual respect instead of need and manipulation. I'd like that, I said. After he left, I sat with the check in my lap, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the broken teacup on Christmas Eve, the hidden camera that revealed so much more than I'd expected, the months of learning to say no, to have boundaries, to value myself. The money in my hands represented more than repayment of a debt. It represented my son's acknowledgement that I was a person deserving of respect, not just a resource to be exploited. It represented his first steps toward becoming the kind of man I'd always hoped he could be. But more than that, it represented my own transformation from someone who defined herself entirely through other people's needs to someone who understood her own worth. I deposited the check that afternoon and then did something I'd been dreaming about for months. I signed up for a painting workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A week of art and desert landscapes and the kind of adventure I'd never allowed myself before. That evening at book club, I told my friends about Marcus's visit, about the check, about his apology, about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. How do you feel about it? Asked Janet, a retired teacher who'd become one of my closest friends. Hopeful, I said. But careful, I'm not going back to who I was. Good, said Helen. That woman was drowning. This woman is flying. She was right, I was flying. Not in the dramatic way of escape or rescue, but in the steady, sustainable way of someone who had learned to trust her own wings. Later that night, I worked on a new painting, a self-portrait that I'd been avoiding for months because I wasn't sure how to see myself. But now, looking in the mirror in my bright apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built for myself, I knew exactly what I saw. I saw a woman who had learned the difference between love and enabling. A woman who had discovered that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to solve someone else's problems. A woman who had found herself by finally saying no to everyone else's demands. I painted until dawn, capturing the light in my own eyes, the strength in my own hands, the peace in my own expression. When I finally stepped back to look at what I'd created, I saw a portrait of someone I was proud to be. The woman in the painting wasn't perfect. She showed the lines of age, the marks of struggle, the evidence of a life fully lived. But she also showed something else, the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to value herself. 6 months later, I had coffee with Marcus for the first time in over a year. We met at a small cafe near Lincoln Park, neutral territory where neither of us had old memories to navigate. He looked good, healthy, and rested in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. We talked about his job, about my art, about books we'd been reading and movies we'd enjoyed. It felt strange and wonderful to have a conversation that wasn't about his problems or my solutions. "I've been thinking," he said as we prepared to leave, "about why it took me so long to grow up." "What conclusion did you reach?" "I think I was afraid that if I became independent, you wouldn't love me anymore. Like your love was conditional on me needing you." The insight was so accurate it took my breath away. "And what do you think now?" "Now I think real love supports independence, not dependence. I think you stopped enabling me because you loved me, not because you stopped loving me." We hugged goodbye, carefully, like people who are learning to trust each other again, and made plans to have dinner the following month. Walking home through the park, I thought about the complexity of family relationships. How love can become twisted into control. How help can become harm. How the desire to protect can become the very thing that prevents growth. I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 years earlier, frantically trying to solve everyone else's problems while neglecting her own life. That woman had been drowning in other people's needs, so focused on being needed that she'd forgotten how to be herself. The woman I'd become understood that love sometimes requires letting people struggle. That growth happens in the discomfort between problems and solutions. That the most loving thing you can sometimes do is step back and let someone figure out their own life. As I walked home, I passed families in the park, couples holding hands, children playing while their parents watched. I saw the complicated dance of care and independence that healthy relationships require, the balance between support and enablement, between love and suffocation. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "Gallery opening Friday night. Want to come admire each other's work and drink cheap wine?" I texted back, "Absolutely. Life is good." And it was good. Different than I'd ever imagined it could be, but good in ways I'd never allowed myself to want. Full of friendships based on mutual enjoyment rather than mutual need. Full of activities chosen for pleasure rather than obligation. Full of days when my first thought wasn't about someone else's crisis. That night, I started a new painting, a view of Chicago from across the lake, with the skyline rising like a promise against the horizon. The city where I'd learned to say no, where I'd discovered that love doesn't require self-sacrifice, where I'd found myself by finally refusing to lose myself in other people's problems. The painting took weeks to complete, layer after layer of color building up to create something complex and beautiful and true, like the life I'd built for myself, one careful choice at a time. When it was finished, I hung it in the place of honor in my living room, where it caught the morning light and reminded me every day of how far I'd come. From the woman who broke a teacup on Christmas Eve to the woman who could paint her own view of the world. From someone who said yes to everyone else, to someone who finally learned to say yes to herself. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, I want you to know that transformation is possible at any age, that it's never too late to learn your own worth, that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of their dysfunction. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're the person whose love is being used against you, whose generosity is being exploited, whose kindness is being treated as weakness, I want you to know that you're not alone. You have the right to boundaries. You have the right to be treated with respect. You have the right to a life that's about more than solving other people's problems. It won't be easy. The people who benefit from your self-sacrifice will fight to keep you in that role. They'll use guilt and manipulation and emotional blackmail to convince you that setting boundaries means you don't really love them. But real love, the kind that nurtures growth and honors dignity, sometimes requires saying no. Sometimes requires stepping back and letting people experience the consequences of their choices. Sometimes requires valuing yourself enough to stop enabling someone else's worst impulses. The camera I installed that Christmas Eve was supposed to protect my son. Instead, it showed me something I needed to see about myself. That I'd become so focused on being needed that I'd forgotten how to be valued. The money Marcus took from me wasn't just about dollars and cents. It was about respect, about honesty, about the basic reciprocity that healthy relationships require. But giving him that money back was the best investment I ever made in our relationship, because it forced both of us to grow. It forced him to learn responsibility, and me to learn boundaries. It forced us both to discover who we were beyond the dysfunctional dance of crisis and rescue. Today, Marcus and I have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than mutual need. We have coffee once a month, dinner on holidays, phone calls that aren't about emergencies. He tells me about his life. I tell him about mine. And neither of us expects the other to fix what's broken. It's not the relationship I thought I wanted when he was young. It's better. It's real. Have you lived something similar to this story? Have you found yourself giving and giving until there was nothing left of yourself? Have you been someone's personal ATM, their constant rescuer, their parent long past the age when parenting should have ended? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this video resonated with you, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, please like it and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can learn to love without losing ourselves. Together, we can discover that the most beautiful relationships are the ones where both people are free to be themselves. Remember, you are worthy of love that doesn't cost you your dignity. You deserve relationships that nourish you instead of depleting you. You have the right to say no, to have boundaries, to choose yourself. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Your new life is waiting. All you have to do is choose it.